Plato's mysterious tale. In the quiet twilight of the 4th century BCE, the philosopher Plato set quill to wax and began weaving a story that has since lingered like a ghost across millennia. Within his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he spoke of a land beyond the horizon, a glittering empire that rose to heights of power only to vanish beneath the sea. Atlantis, the very name carried forward in countless languages, still carries the weight of mystery. Yet, when Plato wrote these words, he was not offering a sailor's logbook or a king's chronicle. He was building a parable, part history, part allegory, designed to provoke his students into thinking about virtue, corruption, and the fragility of civilization itself. Plato was not a historian in the way Herodotus or Thucydides attempted to be. His work bent toward philosophy, often framing grand stories as mirrors for human conduct. And yet, buried within his dialogues, Atlantis comes with remarkable detail: geography, politics, architecture, even the genealogy of its rulers. That richness tempts us still, making it difficult to dismiss as mere invention. Scholars have long debated whether Plato was recalling a genuine tale passed down from the ancients, or whether Atlantis was entirely his literary stage, a cautionary parable dressed in mythic grandeur. In Timaeus, the story arrives casually, almost as an aside. Plato places it in the mouth of Critias, who claims his grandfather heard it from Solon, the respected Athenian lawgiver. Solon, travelling in Egypt a century before, had conversed with priests at Sais, who supposedly preserved memories far older than those of Greece itself. They told him of a mighty island empire that flourished 9,000 years before his time. It had once tried to conquer the Mediterranean, only to be repelled by the virtuous Athenians of a distant heroic age. Soon after, the gods themselves sank Atlantis beneath the sea. Thus, in Plato's telling, Athens not only defended freedom, but embodied moral superiority over a decadent adversary. Mainstream fact reminds us, Plato was writing around 360 BCE, decades after Athens' golden age had dimmed. His city had endured defeat in the Peloponnesian War, seen democracy falter, and witnessed the execution of his teacher, Socrates. Against this backdrop, Atlantis could be read as more than a vanished island. It was a stage for Plato's philosophy, a place to explore his ideas of the just state, of hubris punished, of Athens as an eternal ideal. In this light, the story of Atlantis resembles a morality play as much as a geographical memory. Yet curiously, the details shine with strange precision. Plato describes an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, ringed with mountains, possessing fertile plains, and nourished by an ingenious system of canals. He even specifies metals unknown to us, like orichalcum, a glittering alloy prized second only to gold. These touches, so concrete and almost technical, encourage those who believe the philosopher was reporting fact disguised as allegory. Scholars still debate whether this specificity was meant to persuade skeptical readers of a fabricated tale, or whether Plato himself genuinely drew upon fragments of older traditions whispered across cultures. And here enters a quirky detail. Renaissance alchemists and later occultists seized upon Plato's mention of orichalcum. They claimed it was proof of lost Atlantean technology, a mystical metal that harnessed cosmic energies. In modern times, divers near Sicily recovered ingots of a copper-zinc alloy that some enthusiasts hurried to identify as orichalcum itself, though metallurgists caution it was likely just a common form of brass. Still, the allure persists, the sense that Plato was hinting at a forgotten science, a technology drowned with its makers. Thus, with a few passages, Plato did more than set a philosophical scene. He birthed one of the most enduring mysteries in human storytelling. From the marble colonnades of Athens, a tale meant to stir discussion has echoed outward, reshaped with each generation. We must remember, at this stage, Atlantis is not yet a sunken city glimpsed in sonar scans, nor a utopia longed for by dreamers. It is words in a dialogue, carefully chosen, hinting at truths larger than geography. As Plato himself surely knew, stories once told take on lives of their own, echoes of Solon. The philosopher's tale, as compelling as it was, did not begin in Athens alone. According to Plato, the seed of Atlantis reached Greece through a man of profound stature, Solon, the legendary lawgiver. Solon lived in the early 6th century BCE, centuries before Plato, and was remembered not only as a poet and statesman, but as the architect of reforms that laid the groundwork for Athenian democracy. His life intersected with a period when Greece was still shaping its identity, emerging from aristocratic rule, experimenting with civic participation, and expanding horizons across the Mediterranean. It is here that the tale deepens. Solon, during his travels, reportedly journeyed to Egypt, to the delta city of Sais. Egypt, with its monumental temples and millennia of written history, stood as a living archive of memory in the eyes of the Greeks. While their own myths stretched back to heroic ancestors, the Egyptians possessed records and traditions so ancient they dwarfed the Hellenic imagination. Plato tells us Solon conversed with priests who spoke of disasters long forgotten by Greece, of cities drowned and civilizations erased by flood and fire. Among these was Atlantis. The priests allegedly chided Solon for the shortness of Greek memory. "You Hellenes are always children," they said, noting that Greece knew only the most recent of catastrophes, while Egypt preserved accounts reaching back thousands of years. They spoke of an island beyond the pillars of Heracles, rich and mighty, whose kings sought dominion over the Mediterranean world. When virtue gave way to hubris, Atlantis was punished by the gods, lost beneath the ocean in a single dreadful night. Solon, impressed and perhaps unsettled, carried the story back to Athens, where it would linger until Plato transformed it into philosophy. Mainstream fact anchors us. Solon indeed travelled widely during his life, including to Egypt around the year 590 BCE. Inscriptions and records confirm the presence of Greek visitors in Egyptian courts during this period. Exchanges of knowledge, mathematics, and myth certainly occurred. Whether Egyptian priests truly told Solon of Atlantis, however, is less certain. Egyptian temple inscriptions, so far as we know, contain no explicit mention of such an island. Yet scholars still debate whether the priest's story was an invention of Plato, or whether Solon indeed heard echoes of a much older myth refracted through Egyptian memory. The quirky fringe tidbit here is irresistible. Some later writers suggested that Egyptian archives might have contained faded memories of real geological cataclysms. Enthusiasts point to the end of the Ice Age, when rising seas swallowed vast tracts of land. They argue that the Egyptian priests may have preserved oral echoes of such global floods, passing them on to Greek visitors like Solon. Others even claim that Atlantis's destruction paralleled the biblical flood of Noah, suggesting a universal catastrophe remembered in different tongues. These claims are tantalizing, though evidence remains elusive. Still, the image of Solon sitting in a dim-lit Egyptian hall, listening to stories of drowned empires, resonates deeply. It positions Atlantis not merely as a Greek invention, but as a tale rooted in the great exchanges between civilizations. Egypt, with its libraries of papyri and priests as guardians of ancient wisdom, lent authority to the legend. And perhaps this was Plato's intention. By anchoring his myth in Solon's reputation and Egyptian antiquity, he ensured that Atlantis would carry the weight of borrowed credibility. In this way, the Atlantis story began its journey, not in Plato's pen alone, but through the imagined figure of Solon returning from Egypt with secrets whispered across borders. Stories, after all, often cross seas long before they cross centuries. Whether Solon heard of Atlantis in reality or only in Plato's crafted narrative, he became the bridge between Egyptian antiquity and Greek philosophy. And from there, the legend of Atlantis would be passed down like a torch, flickering across generations, its flame never quite extinguished. The ideal state imagined. When we return to Plato's dialogues, it becomes clear that Atlantis was not merely offered as a curiosity about far-off seas. Instead, it functioned as part of a broader philosophical exercise, a foil against which Plato could project his ideas of justice, order, and the ideal state. In Critias, the tale is set up as a grand lesson, meant to illustrate how societies flourish when they remain virtuous, and how they collapse when greed and arrogance corrode their moral foundations. Atlantis, in other words, was never only about geography, it was about ethics. Plato's vision of the ideal society was outlined most famously in the Republic. There, he described a city guided by philosopher kings, balanced between the needs of warrior guardians, producers, and rulers who governed not for personal gain, but for the collective good. When he introduced Atlantis into Timaeus and Critias, he placed it alongside Athens itself, creating a moral contrast. Athens, in his account, embodied discipline, courage, and restraint, while Atlantis, though wealthy and magnificent, succumbed to corruption. In that juxtaposition, Plato allowed Athens to shine as a model of virtue, while Atlantis became the cautionary tale. Mainstream fact reminds us, Athens, during Plato's lifetime, was in turmoil. The city had once stood as the beacon of democracy and cultural brilliance, producing drama, art, and philosophy in dazzling abundance. But after its crushing defeat in the Peloponnesian War at the hands of Sparta, Athens's political and moral authority faltered. Plato himself grew skeptical of democracy, especially after his teacher Socrates was condemned to death by a jury. Thus, when he described Athens as the virtuous adversary of Atlantis, it may have been less a reflection of his present city than of an ideal Athens, an aspirational image of what the polis might have been or could yet become. And yet, quirky interpretations abound. Some have argued that Atlantis represented not only a moral allegory, but a critique of imperial overreach. In Plato's time, Athens had pursued empire, collecting tribute from its allies and enforcing dominance over the Aegean. To critics, Athens itself was at risk of becoming the very Atlantis Plato condemned, wealthy, arrogant, and destined to fall. Scholars still debate whether Plato was gently criticizing his own city, or whether Atlantis was meant solely as an abstract example, a what-if scenario, to drive home a philosophical lesson. For Plato's audience, the lesson would have been unmistakable. A society grounded in moderation and justice, like the idealized Athens, could withstand threats from abroad. A society obsessed with wealth and indulgence, like Atlantis, was doomed to collapse under its own weight. The story thus functioned like a parable, a mirror held up to human ambition. Its appeal lay not only in the drama of cataclysm, but in the uncomfortable familiarity of its message. Even as Plato's students might have marvelled at descriptions of canals, palaces, and temples gleaming with orichalcum, they were meant to reflect on their own society, its strengths and its flaws. Yet the strange power of the Atlantis myth lies in its slipperiness. Though Plato intended it as a moral tale, readers across the centuries seized upon its literal detail. The glittering city with concentric harbours and vast plains seemed too real, too vivid to be dismissed as mere metaphor. People began to search for it, to locate it on maps, to speculate on its fate. What began as an illustration of virtue and corruption became, in the imagination of generations, the greatest archaeological treasure hunt in history. Thus, through Plato's framing, Atlantis served two masters, philosophy and legend, It was at once a parable of the dangers of hubris and a tantalizing hint of a world lost to the sea. Perhaps this dual nature explains why it has endured, carried forward not only by philosophers and historians, but by explorers, dreamers, and storytellers who sought in it both wisdom and wonder. 9,000 years before, one of the most striking details in Plato's account is the timeline. Atlantis, he wrote, had flourished and fallen not a mere few centuries before, but an astonishing 9,000 years earlier. For his Greek audience, this claim would have stretched the imagination. At a time when their own recorded history barely reached back 500 years, Plato invoked a civilization whose destruction predated the founding of Athens by millennia. It was a span so vast it almost touched myth itself. According to Timaeus, the Egyptian priests who spoke with Solon placed the great war between Athens and Atlantis at this incomprehensible distance in the past. Their claim was simple. While Greek records were constantly erased by floods and fires, Egyptian memory stretched far deeper. This immense chronology lent the tale both authority and mystery. It gave Atlantis a grandeur that ordinary history could not contain, a civilization lost not in living memory, but in the dim shadows of antiquity. Mainstream fact reminds us, Plato was writing around 360 BCE. If taken literally, his timeline would place the destruction of Atlantis around 9600 BCE, deep into the late Ice Age, long before the rise of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or any known urban culture. Archaeology tells us that at this time, humans were still largely hunter-gatherers, though some regions had begun experimenting with early agriculture. Cities, as Plato described them, ornate temples, vast navies, organized empires, were, by all accepted evidence, thousands of years in the future. Scholars therefore treat the 9,000-year date with caution, often suggesting it was a mistranslation or exaggeration. Perhaps the Egyptians spoke of 900 years, which would place Atlantis in a more believable Bronze Age context. Yet quirky theories bloom in this gap. Some enthusiasts suggest that Plato's date was accurate and that Atlantis was indeed a civilization predating all others. They point to enigmatic ruins, like the megalithic site of Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, built around 9500 BCE, as evidence that advanced societies may have existed earlier than we once believed. Others claim the melting of Ice Age glaciers, which caused sea levels to rise by more than 100 meters, could have drowned entire coastal settlements, leaving no trace. For them, Atlantis' destruction in that ancient time is not fantasy, but memory. Scholars still debate whether Plato intended the 9,000-year figure literally or symbolically. Was it a rhetorical device designed to make Atlantis seem impossibly ancient and thus more impressive? Or did Plato's reliance on Egyptian chronology, different in its reckoning of years and dynasties, lead to confusion in translation? The ambiguity remains unresolved. What is clear is that the number amplified the myth's resonance. A city destroyed only a few centuries earlier might have been remembered or found. A city lost 9 millennia ago, however, belongs to the unreachable past, its silence inviting speculation. This immense timeline also carried an implicit lesson. By placing Atlantis so far in the past, Plato suggested that civilizations, no matter how powerful, rise and fall in cycles beyond ordinary human comprehension. Empires might think themselves eternal, yet even the greatest can vanish into obscurity. For Plato's audience, it was a humbling reminder. Athens, Sparta, Persia, all of these too would one day fade. In that sense, the 9,000-year span was not just a date, it was a meditation on time itself. Thus, with a single number, Plato set Atlantis apart from ordinary myth. He transformed it into something primordial, a story that brushed against the very origins of human memory, whether exaggeration, mistranslation, or hidden. In truth, The claim ensured that Atlantis would forever hover on the boundary between history and prehistory, an enigma not easily dismissed. The island beyond pillars. Atlantis, Plato tells us, lay beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for what we call the Strait of Gibraltar. For the Greeks, this narrow channel between Spain and Morocco marked the edge of the known world. Beyond it stretched the boundless Atlantic, a vast ocean whispered about in myths but seldom sailed. To place Atlantis, there was to situate it just past the horizon of familiarity, close enough to seem real, yet far enough to remain elusive. In Timaeus, the Egyptian priests tell Solon that Atlantis was an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. This bold claim gave the landmass an almost continental scale. It was not a small isle like Crete or Cyprus, but a world unto itself. Positioned in the Atlantic, it became a stepping stone between the Mediterranean and lands unknown. This geographical placement was powerful. It offered a bridge between the familiar centres of civilization and the mysteries of the wide ocean. Mainstream fact grounds us here. The Pillars of Heracles, Gibraltar's twin promontories, were indeed viewed as the edge of the earth by many Greeks. Beyond lay the Atlantic, rarely crossed. By Plato's day, Greek sailors ventured mostly within the Mediterranean, though Phoenicians and Carthaginians were more daring. To say Atlantis existed just beyond the strait gave the story an air of plausibility. It also aligned with Greek ideas of geography, where mythical lands often lay at the fringes, Hyperborea in the north, the Isles of the Blessed in the west. The quirky twist lies in how later traditions interpreted this location. Some believed Atlantis was not a single island, but a chain of them, perhaps corresponding to the Azores, Madeira, or Canary Islands. These volcanic archipelagos, scattered across the Atlantic, seemed tantalizing candidates. Sailors reported strange flora, unique animals, and towering mechanisms, mountains rising from the sea, all of which fueled speculation. Even medieval maps would sometimes mark Antillia or St. Brendan's Isle in the Atlantic, phantom lands possibly inspired by Plato's description. Scholars still debate whether Plato intended a literal geography or a symbolic one. Was Atlantis's placement beyond the pillars a real-world marker, pointing toward lands now lost? Or was it metaphorical, situating the story outside the realm of ordinary experience? Some argue that by placing Atlantis just beyond Greece's maritime comfort zone, Plato could make it both credible and unreachable. Others suggest he borrowed from Phoenician tales of distant islands, weaving them into his narrative. The very idea of an Atlantic civilization carried a certain grandeur. To Greeks who rarely sailed those waters, the Atlantic was vast, deep, and frightening, associated with monstrous waves and infinite horizons. Positioning Atlantis there infused the myth with both danger and majesty. It also planted a seed that would grow centuries later. When explorers crossed the Atlantic during the Age of Discovery, many believed they might stumble upon Atlantis itself. Thus, the placement of Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles was not incidental. It tethered the story to a real place on the map, while leaving enough uncertainty to ignite the imagination. To Plato's audience, it was the perfect combination of familiarity and wonder, a lost island set just at the boundary between known and unknown, history and myth. Circular city of splendor. Among the many details that make Atlantis so unforgettable, none are more striking than Plato's description of its capital. Unlike the haphazard growth of most ancient cities, Atlantis was portrayed as a planned marvel, designed in concentric rings of land and sea. At the very centre rose a sacred hill where Poseidon, god of the sea, had once sheltered his mortal beloved. From this heart spiralled 3 rings of water, separated by 2 rings of land, connected by bridges and fortified with gleaming walls. It was, in Plato's vision, a city both beautiful and impregnable. Plato lingers over the splendor. He speaks of bridges wide enough for chariots, canals cutting through the city to the sea, and harbors filled with fleets of triremes. Temples gleamed with precious metals, particularly the mysterious orichalcum, which clad the inner walls and radiated a fiery red gold light. Statues of gods and kings towered in bronze, while gardens and baths flourished in the outer rings. Here was not only power but order, a city built like a mandala, harmonizing human craft with divine geometry. Mainstream fact invites comparison with real-world sites. Though no city quite matched Plato's rings, ancient engineers were indeed capable of extraordinary urban design. The city of Babylon, for instance, boasted concentric walls and a network of canals. Later, Carthage was said to have harbours arranged in circular form, a memory preserved by Roman writers. In the Bronze Age Aegean, the Minoans built intricate palace complexes with central courtyards, reflecting an advanced sense of planning. Thus, while Atlantis's perfection may have been idealized, echoes of such structured urbanism were known to Plato's contemporaries. The quirky fringe detail is how these rings have inspired generations of seekers, from aerial photographs of circular formations in deserts to essay, tellite images of geological features. Enthusiasts have claimed to see the Atlantean blueprint replicated across the world. One famous example is the Richat structure in Mauritania, also known as the Eye of the Sahara. This enormous, naturally formed series of concentric rings has been proposed by some as the very site of Atlantis, despite geologists affirming it is the product of erosion, not architecture. Still, the resemblance to Plato's description fuels speculation. Scholars still debate whether Plato's circular city was a literal memory or a symbolic construction. Some argue it reflects his fascination with harmony and proportion, key elements in his philosophy. The concentric rings, they suggest, symbolize order imposed upon nature, an echo of his ideal state in the Republic. Others maintain that he drew inspiration from real cities, embellishing them into a perfect pattern to serve his narrative. The ambiguity ensures that every proposed Atlantis site is measured against the same template: concentric circles, canals, and a central acropolis. The power of the image cannot be overstated. The circular city has become the enduring emblem of Atlantis, reproduced endlessly in art, literature, and film. Its geometry suggests both practicality and majesty, a society that mastered water, land, and engineering in ways almost unthinkable to Plato's audience. It is a design that feels futuristic, yet rooted in antiquity, timeless in its allure. And so, through these rings of water and stone, Atlantis became more than a myth. It became a symbol of human ingenuity at its height, balanced precariously against the arrogance that would soon undo it. The circular city of splendor is not merely the setting of a story. It is the dream of civilization perfected and, inevitably, the dream of civilization lost. Gods and bloodlines. At the heart of Plato's tale lies not only architecture and geography, but genealogy. Atlantis was no ordinary kingdom. It was said to have been founded by Poseidon himself, the god of the sea. According to Critias, Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Clito, who dwelled on a hill in the centre of the island. To protect her, he encircled the hill with rings of land and sea, shaping the very geography of the capital. From this divine union sprang 10 sons, who became the first kings of Atlantis. These sons formed dynasties, each ruling a portion of the island. The eldest, Atlas, gave his name both to the island and to the encircling ocean. His siblings governed other regions, bound together by laws inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the temple of Poseidon. This divine charter established their authority, ensuring unity and loyalty among the kings. Atlantis was, therefore, not only a kingdom but a sacred family. its rulers linked by blood and blessed or perhaps cursed by their godly heritage. Mainstream fact provides useful parallels. Many ancient societies traced their rulers back to divine or semi-divine origins. Egyptian pharaohs were considered the sons of Ra. Mesopotamian kings claimed descent from gods and heroes. Greek myths spoke of city founders born of Zeus or Athena. For Plato's audience, the notion that Atlantis's rulers were children of Poseidon would have felt familiar, lending the story an air of authenticity. Divine ancestry was not just mythic flourish, it was political legitimacy. A quirky detail arises in the later interpretations of this lineage. Some mystics and esoteric writers claimed the Atlanteans were a distinct race, taller, stronger, and more advanced than ordinary humans. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, occult traditions even imagined Atlanteans with psychic abilities or crystalline technology, attributing their powers to their divine bloodline. Fringe theorists went further, suggesting that remnants of these god-descended rulers survived in other cultures after Atlantis's fall. Such ideas, though unsupported by evidence, reveal how the motif of divine ancestry captured imaginations long after Plato. Scholars still debate what Plato intended with this genealogy. Was Poseidon's role simply a mythic flourish, a way to frame Atlantis in the language of traditional myth, or was it a deliberate allegory about power and corruption? For Plato, divine ancestry could signify nobility of spirit, but it could also signal dangerous arrogance. The sons of Poseidon began as just rulers, but over generations the divine spark within them waned. As their bloodlines mingled with mortals, their virtue diminished. What began as a sacred dynasty degenerated into ambition and greed. This tension between divine origin and human frailty is central to the story's moral weight. Atlantis began as a blessed land, ruled by kings who balanced strength with justice. But as time passed, their pride grew, and the laws once inscribed by Poseidon were ignored. The rulers who descended from a god proved no less fallible than ordinary men. Thus, in its mythology of gods and bloodlines, Atlantis reflects a universal theme. Civilizations are often born in fire, inspired by vision or divine sanction, but they decline as memory fades and corruption seeps in. The genealogy of Poseidon's sons was not merely decoration, it was the seed of both Atlantis's greatness and its downfall. Empire across oceans. Atlantis, in Plato's telling, was not content to remain an island paradise. Its kings, descended from Poseidon, extended their dominion far beyond their concentric capital. They built a mighty empire whose reach spread across the seas, enveloping territories in Africa as far as Egypt and in Europe as far as Italy. This was no secluded utopia, but a maritime power, wielding fleets and armies to rival any of the known ancient world. Plato describes a realm that was both vast and disciplined. The Atlanteans possessed not just wealth, but organization. Their armies were said to field tens of thousands of soldiers, while their navies filled harbours with triremes and supply vessels. They mastered agriculture, irrigation, and metallurgy, enabling them to sustain large populations. The empire, by his account, was as much an economic machine as it was a military juggernaut. In this way, Atlantis mirrors the great empires Plato's audience would have known: Persia with its sprawling provinces, or Athens itself with its maritime league. Mainstream fact helps us frame this vision. By the 5th century BCE, empires indeed stretched across seas and continents. The Persian Empire reached from the Aegean to India, while Carthage dominated trade in the western Mediterranean. Closer to Plato's time, Athens had led the Delian League, a coalition that became an empire in all but name. To imagine Atlantis as an oceanic power was not so fanciful. It was an extrapolation of trends already visible in the ancient world. The quirky twist lies in how later thinkers magnified this empire. Some claimed Atlantis's dominion extended even farther, across the Atlantic itself, perhaps reaching the Americas. In the Renaissance, Spanish chroniclers encountering the grandeur of Aztec or Inca cities speculated whether these were remnants of Atlantis's colonies. Others believed Atlantean sailors carried knowledge of agriculture and architecture to distant shores, seeding civilizations around the world. Though lacking evidence, these ideas gave Atlantis a global scope, transforming it from one empire among many into the mother of civilizations. Scholars still debate whether Plato's empire was allegorical. Did he mean to evoke Athens' own imperial ambitions, warning of the dangers of overreach? Was Atlantis' expansion a cautionary mirror of what happens when a state grows too powerful, too proud? Or did Plato intend to suggest that even a mighty power, however vast its dominion, is still vulnerable to collapse when it loses its moral compass? The question lingers, unresolved, in the very heart of the dialogue. Yet, in its sheer scale, the Atlantean Empire fires the imagination. One can almost picture fleets setting out from concentric harbours, sails filled by Atlantic winds, bringing goods, soldiers, and governors to distant provinces. The wealth of conquered lands flowed back to the capital, reinforcing its splendour. But as with every empire in history, the seed of downfall lay within its success. The Atlanteans, once virtuous children of Poseidon, became intoxicated with power. Their hunger for conquest outstripped their wisdom, setting the stage for their inevitable fall. In this way, the story of Atlantis foreshadows the cycles of empire we see across human history. From Rome to the British Empire, from Mongols to modern powers, expansion often carries both glory and doom. Atlantis, in Plato's vision, was perhaps the first great warning, that empires rising across oceans may shine for a time, but the sea, in the end, claims its own. The fall from virtue. Atlantis, at its beginning, was painted as a land of balance. Its kings, bound by Poseidon's laws, ruled with justice and moderation. The fertile plains produced abundant harvests, the harbours bustled with trade, and the people honoured both gods and traditions. For a time, it seemed that harmony and prosperity would endure forever. But Plato, with the philosopher's steady hand, makes clear that no human society, however blessed, remains immune to decline. As generations passed, the Atlanteans' divine heritage grew thin. Where once the blood of Poseidon had been strong, it became diluted by mortal unions. Alongside this shift in ancestry came a shift in spirit. Virtue gave way to greed, and discipline to decadence. The kings who had once valued justice and restraint began to covet wealth and power. Temples of gleaming orichalcum were no longer symbols of reverence, but trophies of excess. The circular harbours brimmed not with fleets guarding the common good, but with armadas prepared for conquest. Mainstream history offers parallel examples. Many empires have risen to greatness under disciplined, visionary leaders, only to fall when corruption set in. Athens itself, once celebrated for its democracy and civic virtue, faced decline as its leaders pursued imperial tribute and self-interest. The Roman Republic, centuries later, would struggle with the same problem, its ideals eroded by ambition and luxury. In this way, Plato's account of Atlantis echoes patterns that repeat throughout history, lending weight to his cautionary tale. The quirky twist comes from later interpretations that leaned heavily into moral decline. Victorian writers, for instance, saw Atlantis as an allegory for their own anxieties about industrial modernity, fearing that unchecked progress might bring decay rather than enlightenment. In New Age circles, the fall of Atlantis was imagined as a literal collapse of a technologically advanced society, undone not by gods but by its own misuse of power. Some even spoke of Atlanteans wielding energy crystals or destructive machines, suggesting that their hubris was technological rather than spiritual. Scholars still debate the central meaning of this decline. Was Plato warning against the dangers of imperial ambition, with Atlantis serving as a stand-in for Athens or Persia, or was he painting a broader philosophical truth that every society, no matter how noble its beginnings, eventually succumbs to corruption? The text leaves room for both interpretations. The fall of Atlantis thus becomes more than a tale of a vanished island. It is a reflection of the human condition. What makes this passage so compelling is its universality. We can almost see the Atlanteans in their gilded halls, drinking from cups of gold, adorning themselves with rare metals and boasting of their power, yet blind to the erosion of their core values. Their empire still stretched wide, their harbours still glittered, but the rot had already begun within. This tension between outward splendour and inward decay resonates deeply, reminding us that collapse rarely arrives from without until the foundations within have already cracked. Thus, the decline of Atlantis is not just a prelude to catastrophe, it is the very heart of Plato's parable. Civilization, no matter how advanced or blessed, is always at risk of forgetting the virtues that made it strong. Once that memory is lost, no harbour wall or golden temple can save it. Zeus deliberates punishment. In Plato's narrative, the unravelling of Atlantis did not go unnoticed. When the Atlanteans, driven by greed and ambition, began to extend their dominion across seas and lands, threatening the free peoples of the Mediterranean, the balance of the world tilted. It was not merely a question of human politics, it was a breach of the divine order. The gods, who watched over mortals and maintained the harmony of the cosmos, could not stand idle. At the centre of this council of immortals stood Zeus, king of the gods, whose judgment would seal Atlantis' fate. Plato's Critias leaves us with a fragment, an unfinished thread. He describes how Zeus, seeing a once virtuous race grow corrupt, gathered the gods to deliberate punishment. In a council set within the divine precinct, he prepared to speak, but the dialogue breaks off here, leaving only silence where his words should have been. Did Plato intend to write more and never return, or did he leave the story deliberately unfinished, letting the catastrophe speak for itself? We may never know. Mainstream fact anchors Zeus's role in the cultural imagination. In Greek religion, Zeus was not merely a thunder wielder, but the upholder of justice. As Zeus Xenios, he protected guests and strangers. As Zeus Horkios, he enforced oaths. When societies or rulers broke sacred laws, Zeus was the god most often imagined to intervene. To cast him as the arbiter of Atlantis' fate aligned the tale with familiar mythic patterns where divine justice follows human arrogance, as with Prometheus or Niobe. A quirky fringe detail adds colour. Some later mystics suggested that Zeus's council of gods was not myth at all, but a coded reference to advanced beings or extraterrestrial overseers who monitored humanity in antiquity. In this reading, Atlantis was destroyed not by mythic thunderbolts, but by intervention from superior intelligences curbing a dangerous civilization. Such interpretations, while outside scholarly consensus, show how easily Plato's myth was adapted to new frameworks of belief. Scholars still debate the significance of Plato's unfinished account. Some argue the abrupt ending was intentional, forcing readers to reflect on the inevitability of Atlantis' downfall without distraction. Others suggest Plato simply never completed Critias, leaving us with an eternal cliffhanger. Did Zeus unleash storms, earthquakes, and waves in a conscious act of destruction? Or was his judgment more symbolic, an allegory for natural forces that erase the proudest of human works? The absence of closure sharpens the mystery. What remains clear is the moral logic. Atlantis, once the child of Poseidon, had abandoned the balance of justice. Its kings, once noble, had turned tyrannical. Its people, once virtuous, had become indulgent. To Plato's audience, the image of Zeus deliberating with the gods would have carried a heavy inevitability. When mortals overstep their bounds, divine retribution follows. Just as lightning clears the air after a storm, so too must corruption be burned away. And so, in the silence of Plato's fragment, we feel the weight of judgment hanging in the air. The gods convene, Zeus prepares to speak, and though his words are lost, their echo resounds across time. The fate of Atlantis is sealed, not by chance, but by the timeless law that hubris invites ruin. A night of catastrophe. The punishment, though Plato left it veiled in unfinished words, arrives to us through the echo of his account. Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of misfortune. The image is stark and sudden. One moment, a mighty empire with gleaming temples and fleets beyond counting. The next, swallowed by the sea, leaving nothing but silence where cities once stood. It is this dramatic vision, a civilization undone not gradually but in a single stroke, that has secured Atlantis's place among the most haunting of legends. Plato tells us that earthquakes and floods tore through the island, the land itself shook, the harbours cracked, and the fields fractured. Then, with terrifying swiftness, the sea rushed in. Walls of water engulfed the concentric city, ships capsized in their own harbours, and the once fertile plain was drowned beneath churning waves. What had taken generations to build was erased overnight. The story insists on totality, no survivors, no ruins, only ocean where an empire once stood. Mainstream fact shows us that sudden natural disasters did indeed erase cities in antiquity. We need look no further than the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum in volcanic ash within hours. Earthquakes frequently ravaged Greek cities, sometimes levelling them completely. Flood myths appear across the ancient Mediterranean, from Mesopotamia's tale of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical flood of Noah, suggesting that catastrophic inundations were part of cultural memory. Plato's description of Atlantis's swift destruction would have resonated with listeners who knew the raw power of the earth and sea. The quirky twist emerges in later reinterpretations. Some claimed Atlantis was destroyed not by natural disaster, but by its own technology. In occult traditions, Atlanteans were imagined as masters of cry, Stoline energy, flying machines, or devastating weapons. Their hubris, these stories claimed, led to self-inflicted ruin, a caution not of earthquakes but of misused power. Even in modern popular culture, this idea endures. Atlantis as a civilization destroyed by its brilliance, not its geography. Scholars still debate whether Plato's day and night of misfortune was meant literally. Was he describing a real cataclysm remembered in fragments of oral history, or was the suddenness an allegorical flourish, underscoring how swiftly fortune can reverse when virtue is lost? The brevity of the catastrophe makes it symbolic as much as geological. Empires, however mighty, can be erased not in centuries, but in hours. The vision is undeniably powerful. Imagine the concentric rings of Atlantis's capital trembling as stones cracked and fires broke out. Imagine families rushing to higher ground as water surged, only to find no escape. Ships breaking their moorings, temples collapsing, statues toppling into the sea. In one night, the proudest empire vanished, leaving behind only legend. This is the moment that has captivated dreamers and explorers ever since. It is not merely that Atlantis was lost, it is how it was lost, utterly, swiftly, and without a trace. For Plato's audience, the lesson was clear. No matter how wealthy, no matter how powerful, no civilization is safe from the forces of nature or the justice of the gods. For us today, it is this image of sudden, total annihilation that keeps Atlantis alive in imagination, a story not of decline alone but of apocalyptic finale, Ancient echoes in Egypt. Though Atlantis is remembered most through Greek voices, Plato carefully anchored its story in Egyptian memory. According to his dialogues, it was the priests of Sais, an ancient city in the Nile Delta, who first told Solon of the vanished island. Egypt, with its stone temples and inscriptions carved into eternity, embodied antiquity itself for the Greeks. By claiming that the story came from Egyptian archives, Plato lent Atlantis a gravitas that Greece alone could not provide. The city of Sais was dedicated to the goddess Neith, whom the Greeks equated with Athena. This connection was no accident. If the Egyptians revered the same goddess that guided Athens, then the link between the two civilizations felt divinely ordained. The priests told Solon that while Greeks remembered only fragments of past disasters, Egypt preserved records reaching back thousands of years. Atlantis, they claimed, had attacked both Egypt and Greece in its bid for empire, but Athens, standing alone, repelled the invasion. This tale not only elevated Athens, but also suggested a shared history with the timeless Nile. Mainstream fact reminds us that Sais was indeed a thriving religious and cultural centre. In the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, it was home to the Sate dynasty of pharaohs who fostered connections with Greece. Greek mercenaries served in Egyptian armies, and Solon's visit, though unproven, is plausible within this context of exchange. Egyptian priests were keepers of vast temple libraries where papyri recorded astronomical cycles, kingly reigns, and religious texts. To a Greek, these archives would have seemed limitless, stretching back to ages beyond imagination. The quirky twist is that no known Egyptian record explicitly mentions Atlantis. Despite the abundance of hieroglyphic inscriptions and temple texts, archaeologists have never found a story of a great Atlantic island destroyed by flood. This gap has invited speculation. Some suggest the priest's tale was mistranslated or distorted in transmission. Others argue that Egyptian myths of floods, like the tale of the primeval waters of Nun, may have been woven into Plato's narrative. Fringe theorists go further, proposing that Atlantean survivors founded aspects of Egyptian civilization, bringing with them lost knowledge of architecture and astronomy. These claims remain speculative, yet they illustrate how the Egyptian link continues to fire imaginations. Scholars still debate whether Plato's invocation of Egypt was rhetorical or historical. Was it simply a device to lend credibility, as though to say, this is no mere Greek invention, but wisdom preserved by the most ancient people we know? Or did Plato genuinely believe such records existed in Egyptian temples? Without Egyptian corroboration, the question remains unresolved. Still, the Egyptian connection was powerful. To Plato's audience, Egypt was both real and mysterious, a land of pyramids older than any Greek monument, a civilization that seemed to defy time itself. If such a people said Atlantis had once existed, who could doubt it? The tale thus acquired a new dimension. Atlantis was not only a Greek allegory, but part of a larger trans-Mediterranean memory. It is fitting that the story should pass through Egypt, a land where river and desert meet, where permanence and impermanence intertwine. Just as the Nile's floods both sustained and threatened Egyptian life, so too did the sea give and take in the story of Atlantis. And in the halls of Sais, where gods and history were woven into one, the legend found the authority it needed to endure. Minoan shadows. As the legend of Atlantis spread, many began to look for parallels in the tangible ruins of the ancient world. One civilization in particular has long cast a shadow over the tale, the Minoans of Crete. Flourishing during the Bronze Age, from roughly 2000 to 1450 BCE, the Minoan culture was one of Europe's earliest and most dazzling. Its palaces, such as the sprawling complex at Knossos, featured labyrinthine corridors, storerooms brimming with amphorae, and advanced plumbing systems that rivaled anything in antiquity. The Minoans were masters of the sea, their fleets dominating the Aegean, their art filled with marine imagery that spoke of deep intimacy with the ocean. To later generations, the Minoans seemed eerily like Plato's Atlanteans, wealthy, powerful, artistic, and ultimately destroyed by catastrophe. Their frescoes showed bull leapers and dolphins, a society at once ritualistic and joyous. Their trade networks stretched across the Mediterranean, linking Crete with Egypt, Cyprus, and beyond. And then, abruptly, the civilization collapsed. For centuries, the cause remained shrouded in mystery until archaeology uncovered evidence of both natural disaster and foreign invasion. Mainstream fact highlights that the Minoans were struck by a series of devastating events. Around 1600 BCE, the eruption of the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, unleashed one of the largest explosions in recorded history. Ash blanketed the Aegean, tsunamis smashed into Cretan shores, and the climate across the region was disrupted. Though the Minoans endured for a time, their power waned, and eventually, Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland took control. By 1100 BCE, their culture had vanished into myth, remembered only dimly in Greek legends of King Minos and his labyrinth. The quirky twist lies in how modern writers have connected the dots. The Minoans, with theirs, air-circular harbours at Knossos and their sudden destruction by volcanic cataclysm seem to mirror Plato's account of Atlantis. Early archaeologists like Arthur Evans, who excavated Knossos in the early 20th century, even speculated that memories of the Minoans might have reached Plato through Egyptian or Greek oral traditions. Fringe theorists extended the idea further, claiming the Minoans were themselves Atlanteans, their legacy lingering in both myth and ruin. Scholars still debate how closely the Minoan collapse aligns with Plato's story. Was the philosopher drawing on folk memories of the Thera eruption, amplifying them into allegory? Or was the resemblance purely coincidental, the echoes of disaster a recurring motif in human storytelling? The timeline complicates matters. Plato placed Atlantis's fall thousands of years earlier than the Minoan decline. Yet, the parallels remain difficult to ignore. A seafaring power, wealthy and artistic, humbled by the fury of the earth and sea. The Minoan connection matters because it anchors Atlantis in the realm of possibility. Unlike far-flung speculations of lost continents, the ruins of Crete are real, tangible, and breathtaking. To stand in the throne room at Knossos or to trace the patterns of dolphins painted on palace walls is to glimpse a civilization that once seemed invincible, yet was undone by forces beyond its control. In their splendor and their fragility, the Minoans offer a haunting reflection of Plato's tale. Thus, the story of Atlantis may not be entirely invention. It may carry within it the faint memory of real societies that rose and fell in the Aegean, their tragedies retold and reshaped until they became the myth of a lost island. In the shadows of the Minoans we see how myth and history intertwine, each casting reflections of the other across time. The Thera eruption. If there is one event in antiquity that comes closest to the violence of Atlantis' downfall, it is the eruption of Thera. Around the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, the volcanic island, today called Santorini, erupted with a force among the greatest in human history. The blast tore apart the island, sending ash miles into the sky, collapsing calderas into the sea, and unleashing tsunamis that swept across the Aegean. For those who lived in its path, it must have felt like the very wrath of the gods. The town of Akrotiri on Thera offers a chilling window into this catastrophe. Excavations have revealed streets of multi-storied houses, walls painted with vibrant frescoes of lilies, monkeys and ships. The town was strikingly advanced, with plumbing, paved streets, and evidence of lively trade. Yet one day it was smothered in volcanic ash, eerily preserved much like Pompeii centuries later. Curiously, no human remains have been found, suggesting the inhabitants had time to flee before the final devastation. Still, their world was buried, frozen in the moment of disaster. Mainstream fact emphasizes that the eruption of Thera was not merely a local event. Scientists estimate its force at perhaps 4 or 5 times that of Krakatoa in 1883. Ash deposits have been found as far away as Anatolia and the Nile Delta, disrupting agriculture and climate across the region. The eruption likely generated towering waves that struck Crete, crippling the Minoan heartland. For a maritime civilization dependent on ships and harbours, the impact would have been catastrophic. The quirky twist is how often this eruption has been tied to Plato's Atlantis. To many, the sudden destruction of a flourishing island society sounded uncannily familiar. Some writers proposed that Atlantis was simply a memory of Thera's eruption, passed down through generations until it reached Plato. The concentric rings of Atlantis's capital, they suggested, could echo the collapsed caldera of Santorini, where the sea now fills a vast volcanic bowl. Though the details differ, the resemblance is tantalizing. Scholars still debate whether Plato consciously drew from the memory of Thera. Chronologically, the eruption occurred roughly 1,000 years before his time, far too early for clear historical records in Greece, yet recent enough for fragmented oral traditions. Egyptian priests who observed unusual floods or crop failures linked to volcanic ash may have preserved such memories. Alternatively, Plato may have known vague myths of drowned islands and shaped them into a philosophical narrative. The overlap between geology and legend remains one of the most discussed aspects of Atlantis scholarship. What makes the Thera eruption especially haunting is its dual nature. It destroyed, but it also preserved. The frescoes of Akrotiri allow us to step into the Bronze Age with rare intimacy, seeing the artistry of a world that perished in ash. The silence of its empty streets speaks to the fragility of even the most advanced communities. Like Atlantis, Thera was a reminder that civilizations can vanish in a single night, leaving behind only ruins and stories. Thus, the eruption of Thera serves as both history and metaphor. It is a real catastrophe that mirrors the imagined one. Whether or not it was Atlantis, it proves that Plato's tale was not sheer fantasy. Islands do sink, civilizations do crumble beneath fire and sea, and in the echoes of Thera, we glimpse the terrible plausibility of Atlantis's fate. Helix sinking. If Thera shows us fire and ash, another Greek tragedy reveals the terror of water swallowing land. In 373 BCE, during Plato's own lifetime, the bustling city of Helica on the northern coast of the Peloponnesus vanished overnight. An earthquake struck, and in its wake the sea rushed inland, drowning the city and its people. Within hours, Helice lay beneath the waves of the Corinthian Gulf. Survivors from nearby towns reported the sight of rooftops and temple spires just below the water's surface, a ghostly city glimpsed through the sea. Helice had been a place of importance, devoted to the god Poseidon. Pilgrims travelled there to honour him in a grand temple, a striking irony given that the sea would one day claim the city. After the disaster, sailors avoided the waters above the submerged ruins, fearing curses and strange whispers. In later centuries, fishermen occasionally brought up bronze statues tangled in their nets, proof that Helica still slumbered below. The catastrophe etched itself into Greek memory as a warning that even great cities could be unmade in an instant. Mainstream fact underscores that Helice's destruction is well attested by multiple ancient sources, including the historian Diodorus Siculus and the traveller Pausanias. For centuries, Helice remained a half-remembered legend until archaeologists in the late 20th century rediscovered its remains, buried under layers of silt near the modern village of Rizomelos. The discovery confirmed that entire cities could indeed sink and vanish, their memory surviving only as myth until science uncovered them again. A quirky twist surrounds Helike's aftermath. Some later writers speculated that its sudden destruction, so close to Plato's time, may have influenced his dramatization of Atlantis. If Athens's philosophers needed an example of a city swallowed by nature, they did not have to lose far. Helike was Atlantis in miniature, a prosperous community devoted to the sea god, undone by earthquake and flood. In some fringe retellings, Helike itself was presented as Atlantis reborn, a smaller echo of the larger myth. Scholars still debate whether Helike provided Plato with inspiration. The timing is suggestive. The city's destruction occurred only a decade before he wrote Timaeus and Critias. News of Helike's fate would have spread rapidly across Greece, discussed in symposiums and markets alike. Did Plato weave this fresh catastrophe into his philosophical allegory, or was it coincidence, the two stories merely sharing the universal theme of hubris, humbled by nature? The overlap remains tantalizing, though no definitive answer can be drawn. What Helike demonstrates, beyond doubt, is that the sea is capable of swallowing whole communities. To Plato's contemporaries, the story of Atlantis did not seem wholly fantastical, because they had witnessed the same forces at work in their own lifetimes. A mighty earthquake, a rushing flood, and a city can vanish, leaving only tales and ruins beneath the tide. The terror of Helike lent a visceral plausibility to Plato's tale. Thus, Helike stands as both tragedy and precedent. It is proof that myths need not be born of imagination alone. They often grow from real events, retold and reshaped until they carry the grandeur of legend. When Greeks heard of Atlantis vanishing in a single day and night, they needed no convincing. It had already happened in Helike. Phoenician traders' tales. While Plato rooted Atlantis in Egyptian memory, other whispers of lost lands may have drifted into Greece from seafarers who roamed farther than most, the Phoenicians. These master mariners of the Levant, hailing from cities like Tyre and Sidon, were famed for their purple dye, their trading colonies, and their daring voyages across uncharted seas. By the time Plato wrote, the Phoenicians had long established outposts throughout the Mediterranean, and their influence reached even into the Atlantic, along the coasts of North Africa and Iberia. To the Greeks, the Phoenicians were both rivals and sources of wonder. They carried stories of faraway islands, strange metals, and boundless waters. Some scholars suggest that such tales, transmitted through centuries of contact, may have helped shape the imagery of Atlantis, a powerful island beyond the familiar world, tied to maritime wealth and mystery. For the Phoenicians, the Atlantic was not an impassable barrier, but a trade route filled with possibilities, and perhaps with legends. Mainstream fact reminds us that the Phoenicians were among the earliest Mediterranean peoples to sail beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, the very pillars of Heracles. They founded colonies such as Gades, modern Cadiz, on the Atlantic coast of Spain, and some accounts suggest they ventured farther still, exploring Britain's tin-rich Cornwall and the Canary Islands. Their ships carried not only goods but stories, and in the port cities of Greece, such stories could easily mingle with native myths. The quirky twist emerges in later claims that Phoenicians may have preserved knowledge of lands much farther west, perhaps even the Americas. Though no evidence confirms such voyages, enthusiasts point to scattered legends of islands rich in metals or fertile plains across the Atlantic. In this speculative light, Atlantis Biki ohms not only a Greek philosophical invention, but a distorted memory of Phoenician exploration. Some fringe theories even suggest that Phoenician traders deliberately kept such knowledge secret, protecting profitable routes by cloaking them in myth. Scholars still debate whether such influences shaped Plato directly. Was his Atlantis partly inspired by seafaring tales blended with philosophy to create a narrative both credible and symbolic? Or did he rely solely on Egyptian traditions, using Phoenician exploits only as background colour? The answer remains uncertain, but the presence of Phoenician sailors in Greek ports ensures that exotic stories of Atlantic islands were circulating during his lifetime. What is certain is that the Phoenicians expanded the Greek imagination of what lay beyond the horizon. Their voyages proved that the sea beyond Gibraltar was not endless chaos, but a realm of coasts, islands, and trade. If Atlantis was to be situated there, it was not a fantasy placement, but one consistent with what Phoenicians had already hinted, that the Atlantic held mysteries still untold. Thus, in the echo of Phoenician traders' tales, we glimpse another thread in the tapestry of Atlantis. Not a solitary invention, but a story woven from many strands: Egyptian memory, Greek philosophy, and the whispered accounts of sailors who dared to push past the world's edge. And as with all great tales, the more it mingled with rumour and report, the harder it became to separate fact from legend. Carthaginian secrets. If the Phoenicians once opened the Atlantic to trade and myth, their descendants in the western Mediterranean, Carthaginians, guarded it jealously. By the time Plato was writing, Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers in North Africa, had become a maritime superpower. Its fleets controlled commerce, its colonies dotted the coasts of Iberia and beyond, and its navigators were said to have ventured into waters where few Greeks dared sail. For many, Carthage embodied both opportunity and secrecy, a civilization whose wealth depended on keeping its oceanic roots hidden. The Carthaginians left behind fragments of their exploits, most famously the Periplus of Hanno, a record of an exploratory voyage along the African coast. Hanno described encounters with strange animals, possibly gorillas, burning mountains that may have been volcanoes, and coastlines stretching endlessly southward. Though his account focused on Africa, other reports suggested Carthaginian ships ventured far into the Atlantic, perhaps reaching the Canary or Madeira Islands. To the Greeks, such voyages fed the idea of distant, unknown lands scattered across the ocean. Mainstream fact affirms Carthage's role as a maritime giant. Founded around 814 BCE, the city thrived for centuries, rivaling Rome itself until its destruction in 146 BCE. Archaeological finds confirm their expansive trade networks, extending from Britain to West Africa. Carthaginian sailors were indeed capable of pushing into the open sea, guided by their skill in navigation and their knowledge of winds and currents. This made them both admired and feared by their rivals. The quirky twist lies in claims of deliberate secrecy. Ancient writers reported that Carthage punished anyone who revealed too much about their Atlantic routes. One legend tells of a Carthaginian ship's captain who, when pursued by rival merchants, deliberately ran his vessel aground on a hidden reef rather than let foreigners learn his course. In later centuries, this secrecy fed speculation that Carthaginians knew of islands rich in resources, perhaps even remnants of Atlantis, but kept them concealed for profit and security. Scholars still debate whether Carthaginian knowledge of Atlantic islands influenced Greek thought. Was Plato's placement of Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles an echo of Carthaginian hints about lands in the ocean? Or was it coincidence, a placement that made narrative sense regardless of real geography? The absence of Carthaginian records, the Romans destroyed most of their libraries, ensures that this question remains unanswered. What we can say is that Carthage, through its control of trade, shaped the Greeks' perception of the Atlantic as a realm of mystery. If Carthaginians whispered of islands in the west, the Greeks may well have incorporated those whispers into myths of sunken empires. Atlantis, in this view, becomes not only a philosophical allegory, but also a reflection of geopolitical rivalry shaped by the shadowy reach of Carthage. And so, in the guarded maps and secret voyages of Carthaginian sailors, the legend of Atlantis found fertile ground. The ocean was not empty, it was a contested frontier, filled with possibilities too valuable to reveal. In that silence, myths grew, and Atlantis, the greatest lost land, may have been one of them. The Canary Isles mystery. West of the African coast, scattered across the Atlantic, lie the Canary Islands. To modern eyes they are volcanic jewels of sun and sea, but to the ancients they were shrouded in rumour. Greek and Roman geographers wrote of islands beyond the Pillars of Heracles, fertile and strange, sometimes called the Fortunate Isles, or the Isles of the Blessed. Sailors who braved the Atlantic swells returned with tales of rugged mountains, dense forests, and peoples unlike any in the Mediterranean. For many, these islands felt like a halfway world, real enough to be glimpsed, but mysterious enough to belong to legend. The Canary Islands offered a tempting parallel to Atlantis. They were located roughly where Plato placed his lost land, beyond Gibraltar but not impossibly distant. Their volcanic peaks, such as Tenerife's Mount Teide, rose dramatically from the ocean, reminding visitors of mountains described in myth. Ancient writers, from Pliny the Elder to Strabo, debated their existence and significance, sometimes portraying them as paradises untouched by human corruption. To hear of them was to imagine worlds lying just over the horizon. Mainstream fact confirms that the Canary Islands were known in antiquity, at least through second-hand reports. Carthaginians and Phoenicians may have visited, though definitive archaeological evidence remains scarce. By the time of the Romans, the islands were documented more concretely. The Guanches, the indigenous inhabitants, lived in relative isolation until European contact many centuries later, preserving a distinct culture of cave dwellings, mummification, and oral tradition. The quirky twist arises in the way later generations folded the Canaries into the Atlantis legend. Renaissance explorers, upon rediscovering the islands, claimed they were fragments of the lost continent, the mountain peaks of Atlantis, still protruding above the waves. Even in the 19th century, some theorists argued that the Canaries were the last remnants of a drowned Atlantic landmass. Maps of the period sometimes marked them with notes suggesting Atlantean associations. Scholars still debate whether the Canaries influenced Plato directly. Did he hear of them from Phoenician or Carthaginian tales, weaving their reality into his allegory? Or was their association with Atlantis a later invention projected backward onto his story? Either way, their presence just beyond the Mediterranean's gateway made them natural candidates for speculation. The allure of the Canary Islands lies in their liminality. They are close enough to touch, yet remote enough to seem otherworldly. For ancient sailors, reaching them meant leaving the safety of familiar coasts and venturing into the Atlantic's unknown. To place Atlantis there, or to imagine the Canaries as its remnants, was to give the myth a geographical anchor, a real-world stepping stone to the fantastic. Thus, the Canary Isles became part of Atlantis's tapestry. Whether as the Isles of the Blessed, fragments of a lost continent, or simply volcanic outposts guarding the Atlantic, they kept alive the sense that beyond the horizon lay wonders and ruins we had yet to discover. And in their craggy peaks and lush valleys, one can still glimpse why ancient minds thought them haunted by the memory of a greater land. Celtic sunken lands. Far from Greece, on the mist-laden coasts of Western Europe, other stories of drowned worlds were told. Along the Cornish coast, fishermen whispered of Lyonesse, a land of fields and churches said to have stretched between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. According to legend, it was swallowed by the sea in a single night, leaving only scattered rocks where fertile soil once lay. In Wales, the bards sang of Cantre'r Gwaelod, a fertile kingdom defended by dikes and sluices until negligence or betrayal allowed the ocean to rush in. Its bells, some say, can still be heard beneath the waves on quiet nights. These Celtic tales of sunken lands bear uncanny resemblance to Plato's Atlantis. Both speak of prosperous kingdoms undone by sudden inundation, of warnings ignored, and of memory preserved in song and story. They reflect a universal anxiety shared by coastal peoples. The sea that gives life can also take it away without mercy. Mainstream fact supports the persistence of such flood legends. In regions like Cornwall and Wales, the shifting of coastlines and occasional storm surges would have left lasting impressions. Archaeological evidence shows that sea levels have risen steadily since the last ice age, submerging once inhabited lowlands. In the Bristol Channel, submerged forests of ancient oak and yew, preserved in mud, are still visible at low tide. These eerie landscapes may have inspired the stories of drowned kingdoms, passed down through generations. The quirky twist lies in how these Celtic myths became entangled with Atlantis in later centuries. Renaissance antiquarians, hearing of Lyonesse and Cantre'r Gwaelod, sometimes identified them with Plato's lost land, suggesting Atlantis was not in the Mediterranean's periphery, but in the stormy Atlantic off Britain's coast. In the 19th century, Romantic writers wove the legends together, imagining Atlantis as a vast empire whose fragments survived as Lyonesse, Brittany's lost city of Ys, or Ireland's drowned lands of Loch Ness. The result was a patchwork of myth, each tale lending colour to the larger canvas of Atlantis. Scholars still debate the relationship between such Celtic flood myths and Plato's story. Were they independent traditions born of local experiences with the sea, or were they influenced by Mediterranean myths transmitted northward through trade and migration? The similarities may be coincidental, yet they point to a shared human theme, the fear of losing land to water, of civilizations erased by forces beyond human control. What makes these stories so powerful is their intimacy. Unlike the grandeur of Plato's concentric city, Lyonesse and Cantre'r Gwaelod were remembered as living places, villages, fields, and churches where ancestors once dwelled. To imagine them submerged was not just to contemplate a lost empire, but to grieve for a home, a familiar world now gone. This emotional immediacy may explain why the tales endured, passed on in song and folklore long after the waves had receded. In these Celtic sunken lands, Atlantis finds cousins, smaller, humbler, but no less haunting. They remind us that myths of drowned kingdoms are not confined to Greece or Egypt, but rise wherever humans settle near the sea. And they suggest that Plato's Atlantis, however grand, may belong to a family of stories that stretch across cultures, each shaped by the ocean's eternal power to give and to take. Norse flood memories. Far to the north, where long winters and stormy seas shaped the imagination, myths of floods and drowned lands also took root. In Norse tradition, the world itself was destined to end in water. At Ragnarok, according to the poetic Edda, the great serpent Jörmungandr would thrash from the sea, spewing venom, as the earth shook and waves consumed the land. The sky would darken, the sun would vanish, and the world would be swallowed by fire and flood before rising anew. Though cosmic in scale, this vision echoes the same pattern found in Atlantis, water as both destroyer and cleanser, ending one age and beginning another. Other northern legends spoke in more local terms. In Denmark and the Frisian coast, stories told of Rungholt, a prosperous town swallowed by the sea during a storm in the 14th century. In Icelandic sagas, floods and volcanic fires often marked the wrath of gods or the hubris of men. Such tales, though centuries younger than Plato, fit into a global chorus of myths where land is fragile and seas are merciless. Mainstream fact points to the vulnerability of northern Europe to flooding. Along the North Sea, storm surges have repeatedly drowned vast tracts of land. Entire villages in the Netherlands and Germany disappeared during medieval floods, leaving only church spires and oral traditions to mark their memory. These events, etched into folklore, created a living mythology of sunken lands, what some called the Atlantis of the North. The quirky twist emerges in how later writers wove these northern stories into the Atlantis legend. In the 19th century, German romantics proposed that Atlantis had not lain in the distant Atlantic, but in the North Sea itself, between Britain and Scandinavia. They pointed to the Doggerbank, a shallow plateau now beneath the waves, as the remnant of a drowned landscape. Modern science has confirmed it. At Doggerland, a vast plain connecting Britain to Europe, was indeed flooded at the end of the Ice Age. For some, this discovery seemed to vindicate the old myths. Here was a real sunken land, a northern Atlantis. Scholars still debate whether such connections are legitimate. Did Plato's story echo northern flood memories transmitted southward through trade, or are the similarities purely coincidental? The chronology is difficult. Doggerland vanished thousands of years before Plato, and Norse mythology crystallized centuries after him. Yet the thematic overlap is striking. Both traditions grapple with the fragility of land, the inevitability of catastrophe, and the possibility of renewal after destruction. What these Norse and Northern tales add to the picture of Atlantis is scope. They show that the fear of drowning worlds was not confined to the warm Mediterranean, but extended into colder seas, where tides and storms carved their own myths. They remind us that human memory of catastrophe often outlives the event itself, taking root in story and song until it resonates across cultures. Thus, in the thunder of Ragnarok and the whispers of Rungholt, we find echoes of Atlantis, different lands, different gods, yet the same eternal truth. The sea is both cradle and grave, shaping the destiny of those who dwell beside it. The Arab geographers. As the Mediterranean world shifted and new powers rose, the legend of lost western lands did not fade. In the Islamic Golden Age, Arab scholars and geographers inherited the knowledge of Greece and Rome, and with it, whispers of islands beyond the familiar world. They recorded the Atlantic as the Sea of Darkness, or the Green Sea of Fog, a place mysterious and perilous, yet filled with possibility. Within their writings, fragments of Atlantis seem to resurface, refracted through new cultures and languages. One figure stands out, al-Masudi, a 10th century historian often called the Herodotus of the Arabs. He described islands in the Atlantic, unreachable by most, yet visited by daring sailors. Another, al-Idrisi, in the 12th century, compiled a monumental atlas for the Norman king Roger II of Sicily. In his Tabula Rogeriana, he mapped the known world and spoke of strange Atlantic lands where people lived on fertile soil, separated from the old world by endless waters. To his audience, such accounts blurred the line between geography and legend. Mainstream fact highlights the sophistication of Islamic scholarship during this period. Building upon Greek sources like Ptolemy, Arab geographers expanded the known world through careful observation, travellers' reports, and translations of earlier texts. Their maps pushed beyond familiar shores, probing into Africa, Asia, and occasionally into the Atlantic. While Atlantis itself was rarely named, the concept of lost or mysterious western islands remained alive in their thought. The quirky twist comes with tales of the Magrurin, the deluded ones, sailors from Al-Andalus who allegedly ventured westward into the Atlantic and found islands shrouded in fog. Some versions of their story suggest they returned with strange plants and animals. Later interpreters wove this tale into the fabric of Atlan, 'tis arguing that Arab sailors may have glimpsed remnants of the fabled land, or even touched the shores of the Americas centuries before Columbus. Though evidence is lacking, the story demonstrates how Atlantis's aura merged with seafaring lore across cultures. Scholars still debate whether these Islamic references are connected to Plato's Atlantis, or whether they represent independent traditions. Were the Arab geographers drawing upon Greek stories transmitted through translations, or were they recording entirely separate myths of islands in the Western Sea? The blending of sources makes it difficult to say, yet the persistence of the theme, a great ocean dotted with mysterious lands, some lost to memory, suggests that the idea of Atlantis had many cultural echoes. What is most remarkable is the continuity. Even as the Mediterranean world changed hands, as empires rose and fell, the idea of lost Western lands endured. From Plato's dialogues to Egyptian priests, Phoenician sailors, and now Arab geographers, the Atlantic remained a canvas for imagination. Each culture projected onto its waters dreams of paradise, fears of catastrophe, and memories of vanished worlds. Thus, the Arab geographers kept alive a thread of the Atlantis story, whether knowingly or not. They looked westward, to the fog-shrouded horizon, and saw possibility. And in their maps and writings, the myth of lost lands crossed once more between civilizations, proving that Atlantis was not the possession of Greece alone, but a legend that belonged to all who gazed into the sea and wondered what lay beyond. Renaissance rediscovery. For centuries after Plato, the story of Atlantis lingered in scattered manuscripts, known but not central to the imagination of Europe. That changed with the Renaissance, when the rebirth of classical learning swept across the continent. As Greek texts were rediscovered, translated, and debated, Atlantis returned to the stage. No longer just a philosophical parable, it became a tantalizing mystery, a lost world waiting to be found. In 15th century Florence, the scholar Marsilio Ficino translated Plato's works into Latin, making them accessible to a new generation of humanists. Among the dialogues he revived were Timaeus and Critias. Readers, steeped in the Renaissance hunger for ancient wisdom, pored over Plato's account of a vanished island empire. Some took it as allegory, a mirror of politics and virtue. Others read it more literally, as a record of real events that could, perhaps, be uncovered again. Mainstream fact situates this rediscovery in the context of Renaissance exploration. The late 15th century was the very moment Europeans were pushing westward across the Atlantic. Columbus set sail in 1492. Vasco da Gama rounded Africa in 1497. The world was expanding at an unprecedented pace, and Plato's tale of an island beyond Gibraltar seemed suddenly relevant. Could the new lands being reached by ships be connected to the old story of Atlantis? The quirky twist lies in how the Renaissance blurred myth and discovery. Some explorers speculated that the Caribbean islands, lush and unfamiliar, were remnants of Atlantis. The scholar Pietro Martire d'Anghiera, writing in 1493, described the New World in terms that echoed Plato's lost paradise. Later, others claimed that the Aztec and Inca empires were Atlantean heirs, their sophistication evidence of a forgotten Old World lineage. These speculations, while fanciful, reveal how powerfully the Atlantis myth coloured the European imagination at the dawn of colonialism. Scholars still debate whether Renaissance thinkers understood Plato's intention. Did they recognise Atlantis as a philosophical allegory, or were they swept away by the allure of discovery? Some argue that humanists like Ficino and Francesco Patrizzi saw it primarily as metaphor, consistent with their interest in Neoplatonism. Others note how swiftly the story leapt into literalist interpretations once explorers began returning with tales of unknown islands. The transition from allegory to geography was almost inevitable in an age of discovery. The Renaissance rediscovery of Atlantis matters because it transformed the myth. No longer confined to the realm of philosophy, Atlantis became part of Europe's expanding worldview. It was read not only in libraries but in the journals of explorers, the sketches of cartographers, and the sermons of priests seeking to interpret the new world. It was no longer just Plato's story, it was a question of origins, destiny, and geography, alive once again after 2,000 years. Thus, in the candlelit studies of Florence and the salt-stained decks of caravels, Atlantis was reborn. The Renaissance gave it new life, bridging the gap between the philosophical allegory of antiquity and the global imagination of the modern age. And from this point onward, Atlantis would no longer be content to remain on the page. It would be sought in the very oceans themselves, maps of hidden isles. As Europe's age of discovery unfolded, the map makers of the Renaissance faced a daunting task: to chart a world suddenly expanding beyond imagination. Yet their maps were not purely scientific documents. They were also canvases where rumour, myth and speculation found form. Among the most intriguing features of these early charts were islands that did not exist, or at least islands whose presence was never confirmed. These phantom isles became the new homes of Atlantis in the European imagination. Cartographers, drawing upon reports from sailors, would sometimes mark islands in the Atlantic with careful detail: Antillia, St. Brendan's Isle, or High Brazil. Antillia was often depicted as a long, rectangular landmass in the mid-Atlantic, sometimes called the Island of the Seven Cities, where exiled Christian bishops supposedly fled during Moorish invasions. St. Brendan's Isle came from Irish legend, where the monk Brendan was said to have voyaged across the ocean and glimpsed paradise. High Brazil, appearing on maps as early as the 14th century, was thought to lie west of Ireland, shrouded in mist, visible only once every 7 years. Mainstream fact grounds us in the reality of cartography. Early modern maps often combined empirical observation with myth, since sailors' reports were fragmentary and oceans immense. Phantom islands persisted for centuries, appearing on charts long after repeated voyages failed to find them. High Brazil, for instance, was still being marked as late as the 19th century. These errors and embellishments reflected the uncertainty of exploration and the human tendency to fill blank spaces with imagination. The quirky twist lies in how these phantom isles were linked to Atlantis. Some writers argued that Antillia was the surviving fragment of Plato's lost continent. Others saw High Brazil as a northern outpost of Atlantis, preserved in Celtic tradition. Even the Azores, first rediscovered by Portuguese sailors in the 15th century, were claimed by some to be remnants of the drowned land. The cartographic presence of these islands gave Atlantis a foothold in geography, as if the legend had seeped into the very parchment of Europe's worldview. Scholars still debate how seriously these associations were taken. Were mapmakers consciously preserving myths, or did they genuinely believe in the reality of such lands? The line is blurred. Some charts, richly illustrated with sea monsters and marginalia, clearly lean toward the imaginative. Yet explorers often launched expeditions in search of these very places, investing money and lives in the hope of reaching them. Atlantis in this context was not just a philosophical allegory or a half-forgotten myth, it became a navigational possibility. The persistence of phantom islands reveals something deeper about human imagination. The blank spaces of the Atlantic invited projection. Sailors and scholars alike filled them with paradises, refuges, and lost worlds. Atlantis thrived in this atmosphere, no longer confined to Plato's dialogues, but wandering freely across maps, shifting in shape and location with each retelling. Thus, the age of maps gave Atlantis a strange new reality. Even if it could not be found, it could be drawn, its ghostly outline floating in the margins of exploration. The lost city, once a moral parable, now haunted the charts of the known world, waiting for sailors bold or lucky enough to stumble upon it. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. In the early 17th century, the legend of Atlantis found a new and unexpected champion, Francis Bacon, philosopher, statesman, and one of the fathers of the scientific method. In 1627, he published New Atlantis, a utopian tale that reimagined the lost island not as a vanished empire, but as a model for the future of knowledge. For Bacon, Atlantis was not simply about destruction, it was about possibility. His New Atlantis described the island of Bensalem, a land discovered by European sailors in the Pacific Ocean. Unlike Plato's corrupted Atlantis, Bacon's vision was one of order, virtue, and progress. The heart of Bensalem was the House of Salomon, a great institution dedicated to the study of nature, the advancement of knowledge, and the betterment of society. Here, scientists observed the heavens, experimented with alchemy, catalogued plants and minerals, and pursued inventions for the benefit of all. In Bacon's hands, Atlantis became a symbol of scientific enlightenment. Mainstream fact situates Bacon within the intellectual ferment of the scientific revolution. The early 1600s saw telescopes reveal moons around Jupiter, anatomists chart the human body with new precision, and explorers bring back wonders from every corner of the globe. Bacon himself argued that knowledge should be pursued through observation, experimentation, and inductive reasoning, rather than reliance on tradition alone. His Atlantis, therefore, was not a nostalgic myth of the past, but a projection of the world that might yet come to be. The quirky twist is that Bacon's New Atlantis blurred the line between fiction and manifesto. While it was written as a story, many readers treated it as a blueprint. Some later institutions, such as the Royal Society of London, founded in 1660, were seen as heirs to Bacon's vision of a community devoted to empirical research. Even centuries later, utopian movements from socialist communes to New Age communities looked back to Bacon's Bensalem as inspiration for ideal societies. For fringe thinkers, it was further proof that Atlantis had always symbolized advanced knowledge hidden from the ordinary world. Scholars still debate why Bacon chose Atlantis as his frame. Was he deliberately invoking Plato's tale, offering a corrective to its message of hubris and downfall? Or was he simply borrowing a familiar name to give his utopia gravitas? Some argue that Bacon meant to redeem the myth, transforming it from a warning about corruption into a beacon of human progress. Others suggest that, like Plato, he used the island setting as a neutral stage, free from the constraints of real geography or politics, upon which to project his philosophy. What Bacon accomplished was profound. He shifted Atlantis from the realm of the past into the realm of the future. No longer just a drowned empire, it became a vision of what humanity could achieve if guided by reason, science, and virtue. In doing so, he ensured that Atlantis would never again be confined to one meaning. It could be a myth of loss, a parable of hubris, or a dream of utopia, all depending on the storyteller. Thus, in Bacon's study, the legend took a new turn. Atlantis was reborn not beneath the waves, but in the imagination of modernity, where it served as a compass pointing toward discovery, knowledge, and the ever-elusive promise of human perfection, the age of exploration. By the time Bacon wrote of his New Atlantis, Europe was already deep into the age of exploration. Across the 15th and 16th centuries, caravels and galleons sailed westward into seas once thought endless, and what they found overturned the known world. The Americas burst into European consciousness, vast continents filled with cities, empires, and wonders that seemed at once alien and strangely familiar. In this age of discovery, it was inevitable that Plato's tale of a mighty island beyond the Pillars of Heracles would be revived with renewed urgency. Spanish and Portuguese explorers, returning with tales of gold, temples, and strange customs, often described what they saw through the lens of old myths. Columbus himself, reading classical texts, believed that the Caribbean might contain fragments of paradise or the Isles of the Blessed. Others went further, speculating that the civilizations of the New World, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, were heirs of Atlantis, their sophistication proof of ancient connections across the ocean. Mainstream fact tells us that by the early 16th century, Spain's conquistadors had encountered cities like Tenochtitlan with its causeways and canals, and Cusco with its stone temples and imperial roads. To European eyes, these seemed reminiscent of Plato's descriptions of a great and organized power. Chroniclers such as Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo and Francisco López de Gomara sometimes hinted at Atlantean echoes in the lands they described, suggesting that the New World was not entirely new, but a rediscovered remnant of something ancient. The quirky twist is how earnestly some explorers framed their conquests through the Atlantis legend. A few argued that finding and subduing the Americas fulfilled an almost divine destiny, reclaiming lands once connected to Europe through Atlantis. This perspective blurred myth with justification, presenting conquest not as invasion, but as a restoration of ancient ties. Even centuries later, fringe theorists continued to claim that Atlantis' descendants had crossed the Atlantic, founding American civilizations whose grandeur rivaled Greece and Rome. Scholars still debate whether these associations were genuine belief or rhetorical flourish. Did conquistadors truly see Aztec pyramids and Inca terraces as Atlantean, or did they simply reach for the most prestigious analogy at hand? Some historians suggest that the Atlantis connection allowed Europeans to frame unfamiliar cultures within a familiar narrative, a once great empire, now fallen, awaiting redemption or conquest. Others argue it was a convenient myth to elevate the significance of their discoveries. What is certain is that the age of exploration recharged Atlantis with new energy. No longer confined to the realm of philosophical allegory or medieval maps, the legend became a living question. Could these new lands across the Atlantic be the remnants of Plato's lost world? The Americas gave Atlantis a stage again, reshaping the myth into something global, where ancient stories met the shock of discovery. Thus, Atlantis became part of Europe's encounter with the New World, sometimes a poetic metaphor, sometimes a convenient justification, always a reminder that the horizon is never the end of imagination. In the galleons that crossed the seas, in the maps that redrew the world, Atlantis sailed once more, reborn in the restless hunger of exploration. The Aztec connection. When Spanish conquistadors first gazed upon Tenochtitlan in 1519, they were stunned. Rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco, the Aztec capital dazzled with its causeways, canals, aqueducts, and towering temples. Hernán Cortés compared it to Venice, while chroniclers described bustling markets, orderly streets, and gardens floating on the lake. For Europeans steeped in Plato's dialogues, the resemblance was uncanny. Here was a great city surrounded by water, with concentric districts and a central temple precinct that called to mind Atlantis itself. The comparison was not lost on early writers. Some speculated openly that the Aztecs were descendants of Atlanteans, their city a surviving echo of the sunken empire. The name Atlantis was even invoked in debates about the origins of Native American civilizations, which seemed to Europeans too advanced to have arisen in isolation. Tenochtitlan, with its grandeur and watery setting, became the most vivid candidate for Plato's lost city. Mainstream fact anchors us in the real sophistication of the Aztec world. By the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan was home to perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. Its marketplaces thrived with goods from across Mesoamerica, its temples were centers of ritual power, and its engineering feats sustained a population larger than many European capitals. The Spanish, though bent on conquest, could not help but marvel at the achievement. The quirky twist is how the Atlantean connection was used to explain, and sometimes to diminish, Aztec achievements. Some Europeans insisted that the Aztecs could not have built such a city without inheriting knowledge from a lost Old World civilization. This assumption ignored the independent ingenuity of Mesoamerican culture. Later fringe writers expanded the idea, proposing that Atlantis' survivors had Rossed the Atlantic, founding not only the Aztec Empire but other American societies as well. In these retellings, pyramids from Egypt to Mexico were linked as part of a single Atlantean legacy. Scholars still debate how deeply the Atlantis analogy shaped colonial thought. Some argue it was little more than rhetorical flourish, a way of marvelling at the unfamiliar. Others suggest it played into a broader European need to situate the New World within familiar narratives of rise and fall, virtue and decadence. By framing the Aztecs as heirs of Atlantis, conquistadors could both admire their achievements and justify their destruction, as if they were repeating the divine punishment that had once humbled a proud empire. What is undeniable is the resonance. To stand in Tenochtitlan, surrounded by water, gazing at a sacred precinct gleaming in the sun, must have felt like stepping into a myth. Plato's Rings of Atlantis, abstract on the page, seemed to echo in the very layout of the city. Though the Aztecs themselves knew nothing of Atlantis, their capital became entwined with the legend in European imagination, forever linking the Americas to the ancient tale of a lost world. Thus, the Atlantis story gained new life not in the ruins of the Mediterranean, but in the heart of Mexico. The canals of Tenochtitlan, shimmering under the gaze of conquistadors, became mirrors in which Europeans saw both the glory and the downfall of a people, and through them a reflection of the most enduring myth of all, Maya memories of floods. Further south and east of the Aztec world, in the rainforests of Yucatan and Guatemala, the Maya developed their own great civilization, marked by towering pyramids, intricate calendars, and texts inscribed on bark paper codices. Though their cities had already waned by the time the Spanish arrived, their myths and records preserved echoes of catastrophes that felt eerily Atlantean in tone. The Maya spoke of floods, of worlds destroyed and remade, of human societies swept away so that new ones could rise. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya, recounts the creation of humanity in successive ages. The gods first made people of mud, but they dissolved in water. Later they fashioned men of wood, but these too were destroyed in a great flood, their bodies carried away, their faces devoured by jaguars. Only after these failures did the gods succeed in making humans of maize, the crop that sustained Maya life. In this cycle of creation and destruction, we glimpse a mythic rhythm similar to Plato's Atlantis, societies rising only to be undone by divine judgment and watery ruin. Mainstream fact shows that flood myths appear not only in the Popol Vuh, but across Mesoamerican traditions. The Aztec codex Chimalpopoca speaks of earlier suns, or world ages, each ending in cataclysm, one with floods, another with jaguars, another with fire. Archaeological evidence also reveals that Maya cities were vulnerable to natural disaster. Severe droughts between the 9th and 11th centuries are believed to have contributed to the collapse of their great urban centres, leaving behind haunting ruins swallowed by jungle. The quirky twist arises in how later interpreters linked these myths to Atlantis. In the 19th and 20th centuries, writers like Augustus Le Plongeon and Ignatius Donnelly argued that the Maya were direct descendants of Atlanteans, their myth as of floods preserving memories of the lost continent, Le Plongeon even claimed that ancient inscriptions proved Atlantis had been the true cradle of civilization, with Maya kings and queens once ruling both sides of the ocean. Though lacking evidence, these ideas captivated popular imagination, tying the grandeur of Maya ruins to the mystique of Atlantis. Scholars still debate whether the similarities between Mesoamerican flood myths and Plato's Atlantis suggest shared origins or universal human themes. Were these stories independent reflections of real geological events, hurricanes, floods, volcanic eruptions, that shaped cultural memory? Or could distant echoes of a global catastrophe have spread across continents, refracted into different mythologies? The answer remains elusive, though most lean toward independent development. What is striking is how naturally the Maya myths of cyclical destruction resonate with the Atlantis narrative. Both envision worlds undone by imbalance, swept away by elemental forces, then replaced by something new. For the Maya, this cycle was part of cosmic order, not merely punishment. For Plato, it was divine justice. Yet in both, the sea and sky loom as forces greater than any empire. Thus, in the carved glyphs of Maya stelae and the pages of the Popol Vuh, we find distant cousins of Atlantis, floods that erase, gods that judge, and memories of worlds drowned. And though separated by an ocean, these echoes remind us that myths of destruction belong to no single culture. They are the shared inheritance of all who live at the mercy of the earth and sea. Colonial myths of origins. As Europe tightened its grip on the Americas, the story of Atlantis was pressed into new service. Colonists, missionaries, and scholars searched for ways to explain the unfamiliar civilizations they encountered, and often they reached for the old Platonic myth. If the Aztecs and Maya, the Incas and the Tainos could build cities and empires that astonished Europeans, perhaps it was because they were descended from Atlantis. In this way, the myth became a lens through which colonizers interpreted, and sometimes distorted, the origins of the New World. Spanish friars, chronicling the histories of indigenous peoples, sometimes framed native myths as proof of Atlantean connections. Flood stories, pyramid building, and complex calendars were cast as evidence that these societies were not wholly new, but linked to an ancient Old World source. For Europeans steeped in the Bible, as well as in Plato, this framework was comforting. It suggested that all human culture stemmed from common ancestors, whether Noah's sons or the survivors of Atlantis. Mainstream fact underscores that the colonial period was rife with efforts to fit indigenous histories into European narratives. Missionaries translated native stories into Latin or Spanish, often reshaping them to align with Christian theology. Scholars debated whether Native Americans were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, migrants from Asia, or heirs of Atlantis. Each theory reflected more about European anxieties and worldviews than about indigenous realities. The quirky twist lies in how Atlantis was used not only to explain indigenous origins, but to justify colonization. If the peoples of the Americas were seen as remnants of Atlantis, then their fall could be read as part of a divine cycle. Conquest, in this view, was framed as a continuation of the god's judgment, with Europeans cast as instruments of renewal. Some even suggested that by rediscovering the New World, Spain was reclaiming lands once tied to Europe through Atlantis. Such arguments, though spurious, lent mythic weight to empire. Scholars still debate the impact of this Atlantean framing. Was it widely believed, or was it more of a rhetorical flourish among intellectuals? What is clear is that the idea persisted for centuries, resurfacing in colonial chronicles, sermons, and speculative histories. It helped shape how Europeans thought about the Americas, weaving myth into the very fabric of colonization. Yet the irony is striking. For indigenous peoples, their histories stretched back millennia, rooted in their own cosmologies and oral traditions. To have these recast as fragments of a lost European myth was both a distortion and an erasure. The Atlantis narrative, in this colonial context, became a tool of appropriation, explaining away indigenous achievements as borrowed from a vanished old world rather than born of local genius. Still, the resonance of Atlantis in colonial thought shows the myth's adaptability. From Plato's Athens to Bacon's Utopia, from Renaissance maps to New World conquest, the story bent itself to the needs of each age. In the Americas, it became part of the struggle to understand and control a world that seemed both new and yet strangely familiar. Atlantis was no longer just a lost land. It was a mirror held up to empire itself, reflecting both wonder and justification, theosophy and occult lore. By the 19th century, Atlantis had drifted far from Plato's sober dialogues. In an age of spiritual revivals, seances, and esoteric societies, the lost island was reborn as a stage for mystical drama. Chief among those who reshaped it was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, co-founder of the Theosophical Society in 1875. Through her sprawling works, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky wove Atlantis into a cosmic history of humanity, placing it at the heart of her doctrine of root races. In Blavatsky's telling, Atlantis was no mere island, but the home of an advanced spiritual race, predecessors of modern humanity. The Atlanteans, she claimed, possessed psychic powers and occult knowledge, but their fall came when they misused these gifts. Cataclysm swept them away, leaving only fragments of their wisdom scattered among later civilizations. For theosophists, Atlantis was not simply a lost city, it was a chapter in the grand evolution of the human soul. Mainstream fact grounds us in the cultural context. The late 19th century was a period of fascination with both science and spirituality. Darwin's theory of evolution had challenged traditional beliefs, while archaeology revealed the antiquity of human civilization. At the same time, spiritualism and occultism flourished, offering alternative narratives. Theosophy blended these trends, drawing on Eastern philosophies, Western esotericism, and myth. Atlantis, with its mix of grandeur, downfall, and mystery, fit perfectly into this spiritual framework. The quirky twist lies in the way Blavatsky's Atlanteans were imagined. She described them as giants, some with third eyes, living in a world of strange energies and powers. Later theosophists expanded on this, suggesting Atlanteans had aircraft, death rays, or crystal technologies that rivaled or surpassed modern science. In this retelling, Atlantis became a cautionary tale not of political hubris, as Plato intended, but of spiritual corruption and technological misuse, a story with relevance for an industrial age hurtling toward modernity. Scholars still debate the influence of theosophy on popular culture. Was Blavatsky simply recycling old myths, or did her system truly transform how people thought about Atlantis? The evidence suggests the latter. Her teachings inspired generations of writers, artists, and mystics. From early science fiction to New Age spirituality, the image of Atlantis as a high-tech, spiritually charged civilization owes much to Theosophy's imaginative retellings. Theosophy also marked a turning point. Before Blavatsky, Atlantis had been debated as history, allegory, or geographical puzzle. After her, it became a stage for cosmic myth, woven into narratives of human destiny and spiritual evolution. The lost island was no longer just a question of archaeology, it was a symbol of hidden wisdom, waiting to be rediscovered by those attuned to higher truths. Thus, in the seances of Victorian parlours and the pages of esoteric tomes, Atlantis found a new life. It was transformed from Plato's moral parable into an occult archetype, carrying with it both warnings and promises. And in this mystical guise, it would go on to shape the 20th century. influencing not only fringe seekers, but even mainstream visions of lost civilizations. Edgar Cayce's visions. In the early 20th century, the legend of Atlantis gained a new prophet. Edgar Cayce, the American mystic often called the Sleeping Prophet. Born in Kentucky in 1877, Cayce claimed the ability to enter trance states in which he could diagnose illnesses, prescribe remedies, and speak of past lives. Over the course of thousands of readings, Atlantis became a recurring theme, transforming the ancient myth into a living prophecy for his followers. Cayce described Atlantis as a vast continent in the Atlantic Ocean, inhabited by an advanced civilization with technologies far surpassing those of his own age. He spoke of crystal energy systems, flying machines, and a mastery of natural forces that allowed the Atlanteans to achieve wonders. Yet, true to Plato's pattern, their pride and misuse of power led to destruction. Cayce claimed Atlantis was destroyed in 3 stages, with the final cataclysm around 10,000 BCE, strikingly close to Plato's own date. Mainstream fact places Cayce within the spiritualist and metaphysical movements of his time. The early 1900s were rich with interest in reincarnation, psychic phenomena, and alternative medicine. Cayce's readings attracted attention not only from seekers of healing, but from those fascinated by esoteric history. His visions of Atlantis fit neatly into the theosophical currents of the age, while adding a distinctly American flavor, practical details of technology, predictions of rediscovery, and connections to the destiny of the United States. The quirky twist lies in Cayce's predictions. He claimed that evidence of Atlantis would be found in the 1960s near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. This prophecy sparked decades of speculation, and when divers in 1968 discovered a line of submerged stones, soon dubbed the Bimini Road, believers declared it proof of Cayce's vision. Geologists, however, IDA, nullified the formation as a natural beach rock shaped by tides and fractures. Yet for many the coincidence was too striking to dismiss, and the Bimini Road remains a touchstone in modern Atlantean lore. Scholars still debate Cayce's legacy. Was he a charlatan, drawing on theosophy and popular speculation, or did his uncanny details, such as placing Atlantis's destruction at the end of the Ice Age, reflect something deeper, perhaps even a subconscious echo of real geological events? Skeptics note that Cayce's prophecies were often vague or unverifiable. Believers counter that his consistency on Atlantis, across decades of readings, suggests a genuine connection to some hidden truth. What is clear is that Cayce's visions reshaped Atlantis for the modern age. No longer confined to dusty manuscripts or allegorical debates, Atlantis became a living narrative of prophecy, healing, and human destiny. For Cayce's followers, Atlantis was not only real but relevant, its survivors reincarnated in the present, working through karmic lessons from their ancient fall. The myth became personal, binding individuals to the cosmic drama of rise, hubris, and destruction. Thus, with Edgar Cayce, Atlantis stepped fully into the 20th century. It was no longer just a mystery of history or a parable of philosophy. It was a prophecy of the future, a reminder that civilizations, however advanced, are fragile when they misuse power. And in his voice, echoing across trances in a small Kentucky home, the lost land seemed closer than ever, just waiting to rise again. Pseudoscience and crystals. By the mid-20th century, Atlantis had become inseparable from the broader world of alternative history and New Age thought. Where Plato spoke of philosophy and Cayce of prophecy, others now filled in the details with pseudo-scientific imagination. Atlantis was recast as a civilization of dazzling technologies powered by mysterious forces, especially crystals, those gleaming fragments of the earth that seemed to embody both science and magic. Writers described Atlanteans as masters of energy harnessed through vast crystalline towers, devices that could store solar power amplify vibrations, or channel healing frequencies. These crystals, it was said, not only fueled their flying ships and powered their cities, but also underpinned their spiritual development. When the Atlanteans fell into corruption, they misused this power, and the very energies that had sustained their greatness turned against them, shattering their world in cataclysm. Mainstream fact shows us how the 20th century fostered this imagery. Advances in radio, electricity, and atomic power made invisible forces suddenly tangible. Crystals, long prized for their beauty, were discovered to have practical roles in technology. Quartz oscillators regulated clocks and radios. Piezoelectricity generated tiny currents under pressure. To New Age thinkers, these properties seem to confirm what mystics had long claimed, that crystals could be channels of power. Linking such discoveries to Atlantis was an easy leap. The quirky twist lies in the elaborations of fringe writers. Authors like Charles Berlitz, in The Mystery of Atlantis, 1969, and later popular works in the 1970s and 80s, blended Case's prophecies with speculation about lasers, nuclear power, and psychic energies. They claimed Atlanteans had mastered forces modern science was only beginning to rediscover, and that remnants of this knowledge survived in Egypt, the Americas, or hidden beneath the ocean floor. Some even argued that Bermuda Triangle disappearances were the result of Atlantean energy fields interfering with ships and planes. Scholars still debate how to interpret these crystal-powered narratives. Are they harmless flights of imagination, cautionary tales dressed in pseudoscience, or sincere attempts to reconcile myth with modern technology? Most academic historians dismiss them as fantasy, yet the persistence of these ideas reveals something important. Atlantis continued to serve as a mirror of contemporary hopes and fears. In the atomic age, when humanity had proven it could both harness and destroy with invisible forces, the story of a lost civilization undone by its own technology felt uncannily relevant. And so Atlantis, once a parable of virtue and decline, became a stage for speculation about science itself. Its crystals symbolized untapped potential, hidden wisdom, and the danger of misuse. They gave the myth a new texture, less about geography and more about energy, less about ruins and more about vibrations. For believers, the crystals of Atlantis promised that humanity, too, might rediscover lost powers and transform the world. For skeptics, they stood as evidence of how myth can be reshaped endlessly to fit the anxieties of an age. Thus, in the glitter of crystals, Atlantis gleamed once more, no longer only beneath the waves, but in the imagination of those who sought both wonder and warning in the hidden forces of the earth, ocean explorers and sonar. As the 20th century advanced, the myth of Atlantis moved from seance rooms and New Age bookstores to the decks of research vessels. Technology was opening the ocean's depths to human eyes for the first time, and with it came the tantalizing hope that Plato's lost world might yet be found. With sonar mapping, deep-sea diving, and underwater archaeology, Atlantis gained a new stage, the realm of science itself, or at least the fringes of it. After World War II, surplus naval sonar was repurposed for oceanography. Scientists began to map the seafloor with unprecedented detail, revealing mountain ranges, trenches, and ridges where once only blank spaces lay. The discovery of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a vast underwater mountain chain stretching thousands of miles, electrified imaginations. To believers, this looked suspiciously like the remains of a sunken continent. If an island empire had once stood in the Atlantic, perhaps its broken spine now formed this underwater range. Mainstream fact situates this within the rise of plate tectonics. By the 1960s, geologists understood that continents drift, oceans spread, and mountains rise from the shifting of tectonic plates. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge was not the ruins of Atlantis, but a natural boundary where the Earth's crust pulls apart, birthing new ocean floor. Still, to many outside the scientific community, the idea of continents sinking and rising made Atlantis seem less impossible. If land could move, why not lose a whole island? The quirky twist comes from the many supposed discoveries reported during these decades. Divers claim to have seen roads and walls beneath the waves near Bimini in the Bahamas, Madeira in the Atlantic, or even off the coast of Japan. Newspapers ran sensational stories of lost cities, glimpsed by sonar or submersibles. In the 1970s, a team exploring the Canary Islands thought they had found submerged structures, though later studies showed they were natural lava formations. Each new underwater anomaly was greeted with whispers of Atlantis. Scholars still debate the cultural impact of these reports. Some argue they show how Atlantis, though unproven, continues to drive exploration, encouraging curiosity about the deep ocean, one of Earth's last frontiers. Others see them as distractions, diverting attention from genuine archaeological work by chasing phantoms. Yet even the most skeptical acknowledge that without the myth's pull, many might never have looked at the ocean floor with such wonder. The reality is that the ocean holds mysteries enough. Vast cities may not lie beneath the waves, but ancient shipwrecks, sunken harbours, and even drowned Stone Age settlements have been uncovered by sonar and divers. In these discoveries, the line between myth and history blurs. We may not have found Atlantis, but we have found Helike, Pavlopetri, and Doggerland, real cities and landscapes lost to the sea. Thus, in the hum of sonar and the glow of submersibles, Atlantis found a new life. It became not only a symbol of loss, but a spark for exploration. Beneath the waves, the earth holds secrets still unknown, and so long as the legend endures, every shadow on the seafloor will invite the same question: could this be Atlantis? Satellite eyes from space. By the late 20th century, the search for Atlantis had lifted from the decks of ships to the silent gaze of satellites orbiting high above. For the first time, humanity could peer down upon the oceans from space, mapping the seafloor with radar altimetry and capturing the Earth's contours in unprecedented detail. Where once Plato's lost island was traced in rumour and imagination, now it could be sought with pixels, algorithms, and digital maps. One of the great leaps came with satellite altimetry in the 1990s and 2000s, which allowed scientists to measure subtle changes in the ocean's surface caused by features hidden below. Ridges, trenches, and seamounts emerged from the darkness, turning the once blank blue of the globe into a textured landscape. The mid-Atlantic ridge, already known from sonar, now appeared in breathtaking continuity, its rift valleys and peaks revealed as though the sea itself had become transparent. Mainstream fact reminds us that this technology has revolutionized oceanography. Projects like GEBCO, the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans, and data from NASA and ESA satellites have given us a near-global picture of the seafloor. While much detail still awaits direct mapping, the broad strokes of the ocean's hidden geography are now known. And in all this data, no Atlantis has appeared, no vast sunken continent, no concentric city lurking beneath the waves. The quirky twist arrived in 2009, when enthusiasts poring over Google Earth spotted what appeared to be a massive, grid-like structure west of the Canary Islands. The lines, stretching hundreds of kilometres, seemed too regular to be natural. Surely, some claimed, this was the street plan of Atlantis itself. The news spread quickly, sparking debates across media and internet forums. But oceanographers explained that the grid was merely an artifact of sonar, mapping paths, the imprints of survey ships stitched together in the database. The lost city of Atlantis, it turned out, was nothing more than the ghost of human technology's limitations. Scholars still debate the symbolic role of such episodes. Was the Google Earth Atlantis a simple misunderstanding, or did it reveal how deeply we long for the legend to be true? Even in an age of satellites, when the Earth seems mapped and measured, we seize on anomalies and patterns as if they were doorways to mystery. Atlantis persists because it thrives in those gaps between data points, between science and imagination. What satellites have given us, however, is perspective. From space, we can see how fragile coastlines are, how often the ocean has swallowed land. Entire regions, Doggerland in the North Sea, Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, Beringia in the Arctic, were once fertile plains, now drowned by rising seas. These are real, lost worlds, erased by water, their memory preserved only in archaeology. In their presence, Plato's Atlantis seems less impossible, even if no single island matches his tale. Thus, the eye of the satellite has not ended the story of Atlantis but transformed it. We no longer need to imagine the ocean as an empty blue void. We can see its hidden mountains and plains. And in every ridge and shadow, we are reminded that myths are not always about precise locations. Sometimes they are about what we cannot let go of, the dream of a civilization too great to vanish without a trace. Atlantis in pop culture. By the 20th century's close, Atlantis had fully escaped the confines of philosophy, history, and even pseudoscience. It had become a cultural icon, reimagined endlessly in novels, films, comics, and games. In this new role, Atlantis was not just a lost city, it was a stage upon which every generation projected its dreams, fears, and fantasies. Writers of science fiction embraced Atlantis as a setting where ancient wisdom and futuristic technology blended. Jules Verne hinted at it in 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. H.P. Lovecraft imagined drowned civilizations in his cosmic horror tales. By the mid-century, pulp magazines were filled with stories of Atlantean survivors wielding strange powers or guarding secrets beneath the sea. Mainstream fact shows the sheer breadth of its influence. In Hollywood, Atlantis has appeared in forms ranging from the glittering underwater city of Disney's Atlantis, The Lost Empire, 2001, to the superhero kingdom of DC's Aquaman. Television serials like Stargate Atlantis recast it as an ancient outpost of alien builders, blending Plato's myth with intergalactic adventure. Even video games, from Tomb Raider to Assassin's Creed, have sent players in search of Atlantean ruins, each retelling adding new layers to the legend. The quirky twist is how pop culture often reshapes the myth beyond recognition. Sometimes Atlantis is depicted as a utopia of peace and wisdom, at other times as a decadent empire whose technology spiraled out of control. In some stories it is a shining city of glass domes and crystal towers. In others, it is a ruin haunted by monsters. The flexibility of Plato's sparse details allows each generation to remake Atlantis in its own image. For a world obsessed with science fiction, Atlantis became a natural bridge between past and future, myth and technology. Scholars still debate whether this popularization has diminished or enriched the legend. On one hand, the proliferation of fanciful versions distances us from Plato's original parable of virtue and corruption. On the other, it keeps the story alive, ensuring that Atlantis remains part of the cultural imagination rather than a forgotten text. Myth, after all, thrives in adaptation. What was once a cautionary allegory now resonates as a metaphor for lost knowledge, ecological disaster, or the promise of hidden worlds waiting to be rediscovered. What pop culture demonstrates most clearly is Atlantis's universality. Few myths have leapt so fluidly from philosophy to folklore, from occultism to blockbuster cinema. Each adaptation reveals more about its creators than about the original story. The Victorians imagined Atlanteans with steam-powered marvels, while the digital age envisions them with holograms and biotech. The myth bends but never breaks, carrying forward its core theme, the rise and fall of greatness, the fragility of civilizations. Thus, Atlantis survives not because we believe in it literally, but because we cannot resist its allure. It is a canvas upon which we paint our hopes and anxieties, a story endlessly retold in forms Plato could scarcely have imagined. And in theatres, novels, and screens glowing late into the night, the lost city still rises, again and again, from the sea, enduring symbol of hope. As we arrive at the final stretch of Atlantis's long journey through human thought, what emerges most clearly is its endurance. From Plato's dialogues to modern cinema, from Egyptian priests to Google Earth, Atlantis has been less a place than a mirror. It reflects what each age most longs for, and what each most fears. That is why, though no diver has yet brushed silt from its marble steps, the legend continues to glow in our imagination. Plato gave us the skeleton of the story, a great power, born in virtue, undone by corruption, and punished by the sea. The details he offered, concentric harbours, gleaming temples, Poseidon's bloodline, were vivid enough to captivate, yet sparse enough to invite infinite elaboration. Into those gaps, generations have poured their own visions. Egyptian wisdom, Phoenician voyages, Celtic floods, Norse Ragnarok, Aztec splendor, Maya cycles, Carthaginian secrets, and Arab maps. Atlantis became a vessel into which the world's myths could flow. Mainstream fact reminds us that the story has never been confirmed by archaeology. No ruins of Plato's vast island, no inscriptions naming Atlas, no artifacts of orichalcum cities have been found on the ocean floor. And yet, archaeology has revealed enough real lost worlds, Halike in Greece, Doggerland in the North Sea, Akrotiri on Santorini, that Atlantis feels less impossible. We know entire cities and even continents of land have been swallowed by rising seas. The idea of a drowned civilization, however embellished, fits within the Earth's true history. The quirky twist is how Atlantis remains a symbol not just of loss but of hope. For some, it represents a utopia of wisdom waiting to be rediscovered. For others, it is a cautionary tale of ecological collapse or technological hubris. In New Age thought, it is the promise of hidden knowledge, crystals humming with power. In science fiction, it is the dream of advanced futures. Atlantis endures because it is never fixed. It changes with us, a myth reborn for each generation. Scholars still debate the ultimate meaning. Was Plato's story pure allegory, meant only to illustrate philosophy? Was it based on dim memories of the Minoans or Thera's eruption? Or did it preserve fragments of an even older story, lost in translation from Egyptian priests to Greek dialogues? The answers remain uncertain, but perhaps that uncertainty is precisely what gives Atlantis its life. A solved mystery fades, an unsolved one grows, and so Atlantis persists as both warning and beacon. It teaches that civilizations are fragile, that hubris invites ruin, but also that the dream of a better world never dies. Each telling, whether in Plato's Academy or on a cinema screen, keeps alive the possibility that we might learn from the past, that we might rise without falling, that we might balance ambition with wisdom. Atlantis, the greatest lost civilization in history, may never be found on any map, but in our imagination it will always endure, an island that sinks only to rise again, carried not by the sea, but by the eternal tide of human storytelling. Conclusion. From the quiet halls of Plato's Academy to the bright lights of Hollywood, the story of Atlantis has travelled farther than any ship could sail. It has been philosophy and prophecy, history and hoax, allegory and adventure. Each era has shaped it anew, Egyptians lending it age, Renaissance explorers placing it in the Americas, theosophists filling it with psychic races, scientists scanning the seafloor for its ruins. Through it all, the core lesson remains. Civilizations rise, flourish, and, if pride overwhelms virtue, fall. And yet Atlantis endures, not because of its fall, but because of its promise. It is a myth that refuses to drown, a reminder that within human imagination lies an endless horizon. Whether or not the city ever existed, it lives in the stories we tell, stories that urge us to remember, to wonder, and to dream of worlds both lost and still to come.